Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tariq Tachil, and I'm the director of CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India here at UPenn. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today to today's Saluja Global Fellow Lecture by Ramachandra Guha. Let me begin by thanking Vishal Saluja, who is with us here today, for his extraordinary generosity in enabling the Saluja Global Fellows Program, without which this event wouldn't be possible. Let me also deeply thank LaShawn Jefferson, Spencer Northcutt, and the fantastic team here at Perry World House for helping us host this event. Thanks also to the South Asia Center and the Environmental Innovations Initiative for their co-sponsorship of today's lecture, and of course to my colleagues Michael Mann and Mark Lysette for agreeing to serve as discussants. Finally, but most importantly, thanks to my fantastic colleagues at CASI, Juliana, Georgette, Junie, Alan, Megan, Sarath, Amrita, Shikhar, and Jitendra for everything they've done to help organize this visit and Ram's time with us here on campus. It's my pleasure to welcome Ramachandra Guha to CASI and Penn, where he spent the past week in ways that have enriched all of us, meeting an array of faculty, postdocs, students, and staff. It's somewhat of a daunting task to introduce Ram, given his wide and varied interests and the dizzying array of topics that he's written on. Let me begin by noting that he's a historian and columnist who serves as distinguished professor at Kriya University and has also held visiting professorships at the Indian Institute of Science, Yale, Berkeley, Stanford, and Oslo, and the London School of Economics. His columns regularly appear in the Telegraph, Hindustan Times, Caravan, and Outlook, among others. He's won many awards, too many for me to note here, but they give you a sense of his intellectual contributions, including prizes from the American Society of Environmental History, the Ramnath Goenka Prize for Excellence in Journalism, and the Sahitya Academy Award, India's prestigious award conferred by its National Academy of Letters. Born in Dehradun in 1958, he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from St. Stephen's College, a master's degree from the Delhi School of Economics, and a PhD in sociology from the Indian Institute of Management at Kolkata. This cross-disciplinary training no doubt informs his equally wide-ranging interests, and in terms of his very long-form writings, I've done my best to just distill 4 main areas of contribution. As a historian, Guha is perhaps best known for writing what is likely the most widely read English language text on India's post-independence history, India After Gandhi, which just released its 3rd edition. This nearly 900-page book took a decade to write and provides a clear and accessible discussion of a dizzying array of topics, from the partition of the subcontinent to the reorganization of India's provincial state boundaries, to the suspension of India's democracy during the state of the emergency declared by Indira Gandhi in 1975, to the destruction of the Babri Mosque in 1992, which hailed the emergence of a new and now dominant Hindu nationalism as a major new force in Indian politics. This highly teachable text was also Guha's contribution to what he himself had termed the challenge of contemporary history in India, namely that the country's historians had confined their analyses to periods before Indian independence. This self-imposed restriction, he argued in the pages of Economic and Political Weekly, led to what he termed a paradox, that while India is the most interesting country in the world, we know so little about its history as an independent nation. His call did not go unheard and has led to a flowering of work on post-independence India, including several works supported by the New India Foundation that he himself has co-founded, and several of whose fellows have actually spent time here at CASI and Penn. Guha is also an award-winning biographer of none other than Mahatma Gandhi. His 2-volume biography tries to grapple with the full complexity of Gandhi's political life. The first volume, Gandhi Before India, focused on Gandhi's upbringing in India, in Western India, his years as a student in London, and his 2 decades as a lawyer and community organizer in South Africa. The second volume, Gandhi, The Years That Changed the World, focused on 3 decades that Gandhi spent at the helm of India's independence movement. Just yesterday, Ram held a fantastic and stimulating discussion with students across 3 schools at Penn on his experiences writing and researching Gandhi's life and the role and legacy of Gandhi in India's politics today. Third, Guha is amazingly a prolific writer on that most Indian of subjects, cricket. As an avid cricket fan and former player, he's written extensively on what he has called, and I think this is his most controversial opinion, the most subtle and sophisticated game known to humankind, including the book The Commonwealth of Cricket and an award-winning social history of cricket, A Corner of a Foreign Field. Let me end with what is perhaps Guha's first love and subject of scholarship, and the topic to which he is returning to in his recent research and also for today's lecture, Environmental History. His doctoral dissertation was on the history and prehistory of the Chipko movement, perhaps India's most celebrated environmental movement, whose 50th anniversary we mark this year. This research then became the subject of his first book, the excellent Unquiet Woods, which traced not only the social history of Chipko, but an understanding of how this movement expanded the repertoires of popular mobilization in India. 10 years later, he published Savaging the Civilized, Verrier Elwin, His Tribals and India, on the life of the anthropologist activist Verrier Elwin. In an influential set of interventions with the Indian ecologist Madhav Gadgil and the Catalan scholar Juan Martinez Alier, Guha pushed back against the dominance of North Atlantic conceptualizations of environmentalism and environmental activism as the purview of the well-off. Gadgil and Guha noted that contrary to the expectation that environmentalism would come only from people whose material needs were met, contrary to what one might expect, poor countries and even more strikingly, poor individuals and poor communities within them have shown a strong interest in environmental issues. Guha and Martinez Alier then later coined what they termed an environmentalism of the poor, driven by livelihood concerns and resource shortages, markedly different from the environmentalism observed in wealthier countries, which often centers threats to quality of life, health, and leisure. We are fortunate to host Guha at a time when he is returning to these early interests in environmental history after a period of nearly 3 decades, not brief. This time reflected through his interests as a biographer and in the life of individuals. At a time where I think we are all thinking about our environmental futures, and especially so in India, which, as many of you know, this week, by many official estimates, has officially become the world's most populous country, Guha's talk will urge us to consider our environmental past through a discussion of India's early environmentalists. In this talk, Lineages of Indian Environmentalism. Please join me in welcoming Ramachandra Guha.
Thank you, Tariq, for that very generous introduction. Thank you all for coming here. As Tariq mentioned, we have just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Chipko Andolan, the popular peasant movement to protect and restore the Himalayan forest ecosystem. Chipko has been to Indian environmentalism what the publication of Silent Spring was to American environmentalism. The founding event, the origin myth, the catalyst, the spark, the intervention that provoked, stimulated, charged many other movements and struggles to protect or conserve or restore a ravaged natural environment. Tariq mentioned the idea of the environmentalism of the poor, which I think comes from Chipko. I remember when I first came to this country after completing my doctorate, which is about Chipko, and reading in a book by an MIT economist whom I shall not know, whom I shall not name, the phrase, it is striking, the sentences, I quote from memory, this is an MIT economist writing in the 1980s, it is striking how much environmentalism is a concern of rich countries and the middle class within them. Poor countries and poor individuals are simply not interested. And I read this after I had written 400 pages on a popular peasant movement to protect the Himalayan environment. But of course, they are economists and they are economists. And after I read this book with this resonant repudiation of any possibility that the poor could be environmentally conscious, I came across a greater economist, the works of a greater economist, whom I shall name, George Akerlof of the University of California at Berkeley, who famously said, if you show an economist something that works in practice, he will ask, but does it work in theory? So, Chipko was a decisive repudiation of what was known as the post-materialist thesis, the argument that it was only after a country reached a certain level of material prosperity that its citizens could begin thinking about clean air, clean water, beautiful landscapes, the protection of endangered species, and so on. Of course, there were similar movements in other parts of what is now known as the Global South. Some of you will be aware of the tree planting movement led by Wangari Maathai in Kenya, protests by Buddhist monks in Thailand against eucalyptus replacing natural mixed tropical forests, the movement of rubber tappers in Brazil, led by Chico Mendes, who was brutally assassinated by ranchers and logging interests. So Chipko was part of this, one could call it a southern challenge to the dominant consensus emanating from the high centers of intellectual excellence in the north. Within India itself, it sparked or inspired many similar movements. Think of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the popular movement to save the Narmada River, led by the charismatic and remarkable Gandhian activist Bedha Patkar. The struggles of Kerala fisherfolk against large trawling, multinational trawlers that were devastating the coastal ecosystem and which they depended upon. Chipko also inspired a whole range of environmental organizations in India. One organization founded directly as a result of Chipko is the now celebrated Center for Science and Environment, whose founder Anil Agarwal, along with his colleague Sunita Narayan, wrote one of the first major tracts arguing for equity in the climate change debate. It was called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism, which was published in the late 1980s. Now, through the 70s and the 80s, environmentalism of the livelihood kind was a visible concern in the Indian press. It inspired journalists, scientists, grassroots organizations. These organizations turned from protest to reconstruction. So in the case of Chipko, for example, after their first movements had led to a ban on clear felling in the Himalaya, one of their important leaders, who's still alive, Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who's still active in his late 80s, said it is not enough to stop deforestation. We must revegetate the barren hillsides. And for 30 years now, Bhatt and his team have organized afforestation campaigns across the central Himalaya that have been much more successful, whose rates of survival of saplings have been much more successful than government programs. So that, my early work, as Tariq said, was about the history of Chipko and the environmental debate of the 70s and the 80s. By the early 90s, after the onset of economic liberalization, it was no longer easy to be an Indian environmentalist. You were said to be holding up progress. As you will recall, those of you who lived through those years of the early 90s and the 2000s, liberalization came with a great deal of hype. And it is true that in some ways, it was necessary and important to dismantle the license permit quota raj. And of course, there has been a flowering of innovation, entrepreneurship, productivity since then. But at the same time, liberalization also led to the loosening of environmental safeguards. And environmental sustainability is not something really that the market can assure. Meanwhile, the activists of Chipko and the Narmada Bachao Andolan were growing old and tired. And by the first decade of this century, I think the Indian environmental movement was exhausted, weary, inconspicuous, ineffectual, and it is now revived again through the climate change debate, in which young Indians in particular have been in the forefront. Now, that Indian environmentalism began with the Chipko movement is now commonly accepted, even by people who have never been to India, or know anything about its history and its sociology. But there is also a forgotten prehistory to Indian environmentalism, which is the subject of my talk today. In a book in progress, I excavate the work of 10 thinkers who, in different ways, spoke insightfully and often presciently about human relations with nature. Their work spans an entire century, from the 1880s to the 1970s. They were, so to say, environmentalists before Chipko. Not just environmentalists before climate change, but environmentalists before Chipko. In this talk, I shall speak briefly about 5 of these early environmentalists working in India, not all of whom were Indian by national or racial origin. And let me take them in turn. These 5 individuals, I'll briefly describe their work, their understanding of human relations with nature, the ways in which, through their writings and their actions, they pointed to a different development path than the one India actually adopted after 1947. My first exemplar is famous for many things. As the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize, as someone who inspired Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, as the greatest poet in the Bengali language, as a pioneering playwright, as the founder of a visionary international university that now, alas, has no longer reflects the values of its founders. So this man, whom most of you now will recognize by the brief biodata I've given, Rabindranath Tagore, is known for many things, but hasn't really been recognized as an environmentalist, possibly because he did so much. And there was so much else to write about while assessing and evaluating the life and work of Rabindranath Tagore. So Tagore was born in 1861 in a prosperous zamindari family of Bengal. The family house, which still stands in North Kolkata, which some of you would have visited, Jora Sakho, exists. And they owned estates in eastern Bengal, in what is now Bangladesh, along the banks of the Padma River. And there were many dimensions to Tagore's environmentalism, which I shall just briefly describe to you. Tagore was an environmentalist in an aesthetic sense. If you look at his poetry or his prose, including his memoir, which he wrote when he was in his 40s, they are fine-grained descriptions of trees, mountains, forests, rivers, of traveling in a steamer boat along the Padma and what he sees, the changing landscape with the changing seasons, the flowers that come in March, April, that inspire him in his poetry. In fact, after he got the Nobel Prize, he fell sick and was revived really by his travels through the beautiful Bengal countryside, his first understanding of the Himalayan forest, their majesty, their grandeur, which he encountered when he was taken by his father when he was in his late teens. So there's an aesthetic dimension to Tagore's environmentalism, which I shall illustrate in the book I'm writing with copious quotations from his poems and his travelogues and his diaries. But that's only one dimension of his environmentalism. There's also the educational dimension. Tagore made the appreciation of nature central to pedagogy in his school and in his college. I was recently reading a very fine collection of essays by Margaret Atwood, who is one among several writers deeply concerned with climate change, and who herself was actually the daughter of a forester. And in these essays, she laments that in her school, she was never taught about nature. But in Tagore schools, classes were held in the open and in a shaded grove. There were tree planting festivals that Tagore inaugurated with the onset of the monsoon. He experimented in an institute called Srinaketan with sustainable rural development. So there was an aesthetic dimension, there was an educational dimension, and there was also a political dimension to Tagore's environmentalism. And this was that Tagore recognized that imperialism, Western imperialism, was not merely a system of economic and political exploitation, not just of a system of political domination and economic exploitation, but also of ecological control and devastation. So to illustrate this rather bold claim that Tagore saw imperialism in an ecological sense, I'm going to read out a rather long quote from his book Nationalism, published in 1917 and based on lectures he delivered in Japan and the United States. It's a long quote, but please bear with me. And incidentally, although it is, I believe, and you will agree with me, I hope, vivid and evocative, it was written in his second language, English. And what he would have said in Bengali, of course, is beyond us to comprehend. So here is Tagore about the ecological aspects of European colonialism. I quote, "The political civilization which has sprung up from the soil of Europe and is overrunning the whole world like some prolific weed is based on exclusiveness. It is carnivorous and cannibalistic in its tendencies. It feeds upon the resources of other peoples and tries to swallow their whole future. Before this political civilization came to its power and opened its hungry jaws wide enough to gulp down great continents of the earth, we did have wars, pillages, changes of monarchy, and consequent miseries, but never such a sight of fearful and hopeless voracity, such wholesale feeding of nation upon nation, such huge machines for turning great portions of the earth into mincemeat. Never before such terrible jealousies with all their ugly teeth and claws ready for tearing into each other's vitals." So this is Tagore writing about ecological imperialism. What I think we can fairly, and without being anachronistic, we call the ecological imperialism of Europe in Asia and Africa. So that was Tagore, a brief glimpse into Tagore's environmentalism. My second exemplar is a Gandhian activist, originally born in Britain, carrying the name Madeleine Slade, the daughter of a British admiral, who comes to India in her early 30s in 1925 and spends the rest of her life working, spends the next 3 decades of her life working with Gandhi in the Indian freedom struggle. She is celebrated in nationalist myth and iconography as this daughter of a rich Englishman who came to work and struggle for us poor brown Indians. So as an embodiment of sacrifice, struggle, as someone who honorably betrayed her race, her religion, and her nation to identify with the Indian freedom struggle. So that aspect of her work is very well known. Indians do not refer to her as Madeleine, which is the name she was given at birth, but as Meera, which is the name that Gandhi gave her when he joined, when she joined his entourage in 1925. But apart from being a foreign friend of India's freedom, she was also a pioneering environmentalist. And that aspect of her work is now becoming visible. And there's a very fine PhD thesis written by a scholar in Texas called Bindu Malik about Meeraben's environmental work. Let me briefly describe what Meera was as an environmentalist, since certainly all the people of Indian origin in this room would know a great deal about her as a political activist. So she worked with Gandhi in the 20s and 30s. In the late 40s, she was restless in Gandhi's ashram and wanted to start an ashram or rural settlement of her own. So she moved to the Himalayan foothills, not far from the holy town of Rishikesh, and she began an experimental farm promoting sustainable agriculture and sustainable forestry. And she stayed there for a decade, till the late 1950s, when, because of ill health, she had to return to her native Europe, where she retained her environmental concerns. In this decade in the Himalaya, she anticipated many of the concerns of the Chipko movement. Now, the Himalayan ecosystem is alpine in character. So it's the only part of India where you have coniferous forests coexisting with broadleaf forests. The two major species in this part of the Himalaya are the cheed pine and the Banj oak. And Meera witnessed in her decade and a half in the Himalaya how the interests of commercial forestry was steadily replacing oak with pine, leading to a degradation of the environment, leading to a loss of biodiversity, and above all, leading to an incidence of floods. In an oak forest, you have a very lush undergrowth of shrubs and trees and plants, whereas in a pine forest, the undergrowth is bare. So when you have the torrential rains of the monsoon, there's a danger that with these rains, there will be increased soil erosion and, of course, floods. And there was a major flood in 1970 that reached all the way to the towns of northern India, which in part provoked the Chipko movement. And writing in the early 50s, Mira had anticipated this, that the transformation of the Himalayan landscape, the emphasis on commercially valuable but ecologically dubious species like chil, would increase the threat of soil erosion and floods and so on. Now, in 1959, Mira, because of ill health, returned to Europe. She had actually, before she became interested in Gandhi, had been a great lover of Beethoven. She'd wanted to be a concert pianist. And when she decided to leave India to return to Europe, she settled near the Vienna woods. And when she thought about Gandhi, wrote about Gandhi, also wrote a book on Beethoven, an eminently unpublishable book on Beethoven, as it turns out. But she retained an interest in the environmental issues. And when the Western environmental movement broke out in the 1970s, and for the first time, you had newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, talking about the environmental challenges to humanity, Mira decided to remind them of Gandhi's own early warnings about the destructiveness of industrial civilization. And in her papers, which I was fortunate to find, they were held in private hands, there's a series of letters that she wrote to Western newspapers. I'm sure all of them were unpublished, but they reflect her deep understanding of the ways in which modern industrial urban civilization undermines the very possibility of human life on Earth. So I'm going to give you, as I have with Tagore, an illustrative quote from Mira. This comes from an article that she actually published in 1949 in the Delhi newspaper, the Hindustan Times. For Mira, the rapidity of ecological change and disturbance was a distinguishing feature of modern life. So I repeat, the rapidity of ecological change and disturbance was a distinguishing feature of modern industrial society. So she wrote, and here is the quote, long quote from her, I quote, "The tragedy today is that educated and moneyed classes are altogether out of touch with the vital fundamentals of existence, our Mother Earth and the animal and vegetable population which she sustains." I mean, this line is entirely applicable to the educated and moneyed classes living in India's cities. They are altogether out of touch with the vital fundamentals of existence, our Mother Earth and the animal and vegetable population which she sustains. Mira continues, "This world of nature's planning is ruthlessly plundered, despoiled, and disorganized by man whenever he gets the chance. By his science and machinery, he may get huge returns for a time, but ultimately will come desolation. We have got to study nature's balance and develop our lives within nature's laws if we are to survive as a physically healthy and morally decent species." This is Mira writing in 1949. So I've talked about a great Bengali poet. I've talked about a celebrated Gandhian activist. My third exemplar is much less well known. He was a university professor. And out of my roster of 10, since I'm speaking at a great American university, I thought I must have a university professor. His name was Radha Kamal Mukherjee. He was born in 1887 in East Bengal, but spent most of his life as a professor of economics and sociology in Lucknow University in northern India. Mukherjee was a pioneer of interdisciplinary research, and more importantly, a pioneer of ecological thinking. In a set of very important but forgotten essays of the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, he talked about the fundamental importance of common property resources in maintaining rural ecosystems. Pasture, water, forests. The cultivated field, in traditional Indian villages, the cultivated field is embedded in a larger ecological context constituted by tanks, rivers, canals, pasture land, woods, shrub, and forest. And while the cultivated fields are individually owned, these other natural resources, forests, water, and pasture, were community owned and managed till the British came and usurped them as state property, breaking the link between the community and their natural environment. And Mukherjee was writing about the vital importance of common property resources in sustaining Indian agriculture in the 1920s. It's not till the 1980s that Indian economists such as N.S. Jodha and Nirmal Sen Gupta and Meena Agarwal, or visionary Western thinkers such as Elinor Ostrom, who got a Nobel Prize for writing about the importance of common property resources, really talk about it. So here is Mukherjee in the 1920s and 30s alerting us to the vital importance of careful community management of common property resources. He also published several essays in American journals, urging that sociologists adopt what he called an ecological approach. Mukherjee insisted, and I quote, that the laws of economics and sociology have to subserve the more comprehensive laws of the balance of life. And his essays of the 30s were at once exhortative and meditative, with the scholar arguing that his fellow Indians had no option but to imitate nature's extraordinarily slow methods. And he himself looked forward to the day when, as he said, ecological adjustment is raised from an instinctive to an ethical plane. He urged Indian society and human civilization in general to forge, and I quote here, to forge an alliance with the entire range of ecological forces. He urged humans, and I quote again, to curb their quick and far-reaching exploitative activities by importing new values, the thought for tomorrow, the sacrifice for inhabitants of the region yet unborn. This is from an essay of 1930, published in the American Journal of Sociology. Now, the ideas that animate Mukherjee's work of the interdependence of humans and the natural world, of the web of life and how dangerous it can be to wantonly tamper with it, are now commonplace among environmental scientists and activists. But back in the 1930s, they were precocious and even pioneering. Mukherjee was advocating an ethic of ecological restraint and responsibility that ran counter to the ethos of a rapidly urbanizing and industrializing society. An ethos which was enchanted with the experiments in the Soviet Union with planning, and which recognized no natural constraints to the growth and expansion of urban industrial society. Let me come now to my fourth exemplar. He was a roving urban planner. He was a Scotsman called Patrick Geddes, born in 1854, incidentally on Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, 2nd October, who was self-educated, learned at the feet of, among other people, T.H. Huxley, Darwin's a great disciple, then got a job teaching sociology in Dundee and then botany in Glasgow. There's a museum devoted to his memory in Glasgow, which is called the Outlook Tower, which, and he really specialized in the study of cities, how to make cities more habitable, how to construct systems of energy use, transportation that were consistent with the ecological limits that nature imposed on human life. How to, if I may use an anachronistic term, how to reduce the ecological footprint of the city on the surrounding countryside. That was Geddes' emphasis. And as part of his work, he had designed an exhibition which he called Cities in History, whose title later became the title of a book by Geddes' most famous disciple, the American polymath Lewis Mumford. So he had a long background as an ecological urban planner in Europe before coming to India in 1914 at the age of 60. And he came at the invitation of a friend of his who was in the colonial administration in Madras to display his exhibition, his carefully assembled and curated exhibition on how to make cities more ecologically responsible. Now, as it happened, Geddes came on a ship. His exhibition followed on the next ship. That ship was sunk by a German destroyer. And his life's work went up as collateral damage of the First World War. But he was undaunted. He said, okay, fine. I can't show my exhibition here on European cities, so let me study Indian cities instead. And he spent the next decade in India, from 1915 to 1924, writing a series of plans for Indian cities, which were small, medium, and large. And again, they're a fascinating resource scattered in different archives. And from my study of these plans, Geddes' urban town plans for cities like Thane, Lahore, Ahmedabad, Surat, Calcutta, Dhaka, and so on, I have distilled what I see as three fundamental themes of Geddes' town plans. The first was respect for nature. Each of his plans talk of the renewal of water bodies, tanks that had fallen into disuse, wells that were so important as domestic insurance against the failure of the monsoon. They also pay very careful attention to the planting of trees and urban forests. So that's the first theme, respect for nature. The second theme is respect for democracy, great empathy with women and with the working class. So air pollution, which is now an important issue in Indian cities, Geddes recognized that particularly in factory towns like Ahmedabad and Indore and Bombay, women and the working class were the most vulnerable to air pollution, and his plans tried to provide for them to be insulated from the adverse effects of indoor and outdoor air pollution. As part of his democratic approach, he advocated that citizens be involved with planning. So planning should not merely be left to the experts, which it normally is, certainly in the Indian context. And here's a quote from Geddes that I'll read out about participatory planning. I quote, "As the physician must make a diagnosis of the patient's case before prescribing treatment, so with the planner for the city. He looks closely into the city as it is and inquires into how it has grown and how it has suffered. And as the physician associates the patient with his own cure, so must the planner appeal to the citizen. Hence, the reader of this plan should go around and look at the city for himself. And with this plan as a partial guide, not a full guide, only a partial guide, he may check and amplify the diagnosis and perhaps accelerate the treatment." So there's respect for nature, there's respect for democracy, and there's respect for tradition. He was very interested in heritage conservation. He saw Indian cities with beautiful, old mohallas with gorgeous designs, embodying all the rich and vibrant wood and stone traditions of Indian craftsmanship. And he wanted to find ways of preserving these old mohallas while upgrading, of course, their access to modern amenities and so on. And he coined, there's a motto of his, which I think every heritage conservationist could adopt. It's a 5-word motto. It goes, "To postpone is to conserve." And he urged at this, of course, the idea that, for the impatient Indian town planner, the idea that there could be elements in traditional architecture worth conserving and preserving was complete anathema. So this really didn't go down well with the colonial authorities. And in 1924, in dismay and disgust, he left India and returned to Europe. So that was my penultimate exemplar, the town planner Patrick Geddes. My last exemplar was a campaigning journalist, a journalist I grew up reading. His name was M. Krishnan. He was born in 1912. He made a living writing a fortnightly column for the Telegraph of Calcutta, I beg your pardon, for the Statesman of Calcutta. I now make a partial living writing a fortnightly column for the Telegraph of Calcutta, but that's not the reason I've chosen to talk about him here today. He was India's greatest naturalist. He was a marvelous prose stylist, both in English and in his native Tamil. He was also India's finest wildlife photographer. So each of his columns would come illustrated with a photograph he had taken. And from he wrote the longest running column in an Indian paper, possibly in any paper, from the late 40s till 1996. And his last column was published posthumously. He also wrote a lot, this was the Statesman, but he also wrote a lot for the Illustrated Weekly, the Hindu, and so on, and a wide variety of themes. And yet he remains largely forgotten. 20 years ago, I curated a selection of his writings for the Oxford University Press that inspired two ecologists to curate a selection of his photographs, and which further inspired a Tamil naturalist to compile a selection of Krishnan's nature writings in Tamil. Yet he, in some ways, he was really a genius far ahead of his time. He wrote beautiful English prose. If Indian publishing had been advanced at that stage, well endowed enough to give the kind of audience advances it now can give, Krishnan would have been, somewhere like Vikram Seth or Amitav Ghosh. He was a fabulous writer, but he never had the time or the patience to organize and structure a book-length narrative. He had to make a living to sustain himself by writing weekly and fortnightly columns. As I said, he was a beautiful writer. He was a superb photographer, a master of black and white photography. But above all, he was an all-round naturalist. The two best-known 20th century Indian naturalists are Jim Corbett, known for his writings on the tiger, and Salim Ali, known for his writings on birds. But Krishnan was an all-round naturalist. He wrote about birds, about animals, about plants. He had an MSc in zoology. He did not merely write about what we now call mega-charismatic metavertebrates. The world of nature for him was not merely the tiger and the elephant and the rhinoceros. It was the butterfly and the lizard and the gecko and the snake. He wrote with great sensitivity about plant diversity. There's a story of him visiting the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And how many here have been to the Indian Institute of Science? That's a fair number. And it's by common consent, India's finest scientific university, and also by common consent, one of the most beautiful university campuses in India, because it has this wonderful array of flowering trees. So when they started a Center for Ecological Sciences, they called Krishnan to give a talk. And after the talk, he was asked by one of the senior professors at the institute, what do you think of the tababuya was in bloom, the Latin American tree was in bloom. He said, what do you think of our campus? And he said, disgraceful. Uproot all these trees and plant native species instead. And of course, he was never called back to the Indian Institute of Science. His work, like that of Mukherjee, was of documentation and exhortation. He believed, I quote, that the saving of our wildlife is a race against time. He hoped that by means of the policies he was advocating, that Indians now living can assure to our future generations a joy and a pride in the country's great heritage of nature, one of the most deeply satisfying things that life in India has to offer its people. I have offered to you just brief glimpses of the work of 5 remarkable individuals, each of whom probably deserves book-length treatment, but in my book will get at least a substantial chapter to himself or herself. And these 5 were, respectively, in the order I've introduced them to you: a poet, a social activist, a social scientist, a natural scientist, and a journalist. Now, I see my work, at least the work I'm now doing, of which I've given you a preview, I see it principally as a contribution to intellectual history. But it may yet provide some pointers to the present. I've spoken about what Tagore offers by way of environmental education, Mira in terms of promoting ecologically sustainable rural development, what Radha Kamal Mukherjee can teach us about interdisciplinary scholarship, what Krishnan identified early on as the decimation of India's biodiversity, well beyond the shrinking population of tigers and elephants and the rhinoceros. And finally, perhaps most significantly, in the present context in India, the work of Patrick Geddes on making the Indian city habitable. What I think my talk illustrates is that maybe there is an environmentalism before climate change, and there is also an environmentalism beyond climate change. Let's assume there was no climate change occurring. Those of you who work in India would know we would still be living in a disaster zone. And probably there's a limited extent to which these exemplary thinkers can inform our present day policies. They talk really very much more about what we call green environmental issues rather than brown issues. But insofar as they provide pointers to an alternate, less destructive path than the one our country has followed since independence, I think less environmentally and socially destructive path, I think the work may also have some contemporary resonance. If I may end my talk with a fairly long quote from Tagore. This comes from a lecture he gave in 1922, 100 years ago, where he argued, and I quote, "Civilization today caters for a whole population of gluttons. And intemperance, which could safely have been tolerated in a few, has spread its contagion to the multitude." He then offered a parable of environmental destruction. He imagined that urban industrial civilization would go and conquer the moon. And once it was on the moon, it would begin a process of having finished with the earth. It would then go to the moon, and it would begin, this race of human beings would begin to greedily devour its own surroundings. And his parable continued, and this is the last, I'll leave you with this long quotation from Tagore, imagining a race of human beings on the moon. Through machinery of tremendous power, this race made such an addition to their natural capacity that their career of plunder entirely outstripped nature's power for recuperation. Their profit makers dug big holes in the storied capital of the planet. They created wants which were unnatural, and provision for these wants was forcibly extracted from nature. When they had reduced the limited store of material in their immediate surroundings, they proceeded to wage furious wars among their different sections, each wanting his special allotment of the lion's share. In their scramble for the right of self-indulgence, this lovely phrase, in their scramble for the right of self-indulgence, they laughed at moral law and took it as a sign of superiority to be ruthless in the satisfaction each of his own desire. They exhausted the water, cut down the trees, reduced the surface of the planet to a desert, riddled with enormous pits, and made its interior a rifled pocket emptied of its valuables. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ram, for that riveting talk. And let me now invite, as everybody kind of digests and thinks of questions they may want to ask Ram, let me just point out that when you do have questions, I believe there's a standing mic on the far right corner over there. And so please go to that area to ask questions. But before you do that, we're going to get things started with our two excellent discussants. And so let me invite Michael Mann, who's Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and also appointed in the Annenberg School for Communication and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, to provide his comments. And then following him, it'll be Mark Lysette, who's Director of the South Asia Center and faculty in the Department of Anthropology. Michael, take us away, and then Mark. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's great to be part of this event. Thanks so much, Ram, for this very inspiring presentation. I'm speaking extemporaneously. I didn't really know what I'd be talking about here, but I was sort of intrigued by a number of themes that arose in your presentation, Ram. And one of them is, of course, colonialism and the role of colonialism in the climate crisis, but the role of colonialism in sort of the environmental challenges, the challenges of living sustainably that we face writ large. It's sort of fascinating, as I learned a little bit about your history, it was fascinating to learn that back in school, back in grade school, or whatever we call the equivalent of that, you actually edited a newsletter or a publication with Amitav Ghosh, who of course is a great novelist who's written profoundly about the climate crisis, the Great Derangement, and of course he talks about issues of colonialism. It's something that came up last week in a panel discussion we had about geoengineering. And it's interesting to see how colonialism has actually been used sort of on both sides in the geoengineering debate. On the one hand, there is this sort of notion that it's mostly sort of people like me, white men from the global north, telling the rest of the world what we should be doing, how we can manage climate change through various sorts of interventions that don't solve the problem at its fundamental source, the ongoing production of carbon pollution. There was an op-ed in the New York Times last week, just before our event, the title of which was something like, it was by an African climate scientist, and the title was something to the effect, "Don't use our country as your laboratory." This idea that people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk are going to go to countries like Africa and use them essentially as a laboratory for studying the impacts of these types of interventions, geoengineering. On the other hand, there's an argument that's been made that sort of the global south, the tropics in particular, are feeling the worst impacts of climate change. And those in the global south sort of have the least wealth and resources to deal with the impacts that we're already feeling. If we believe that we are unlikely to take the actions necessary to prevent a worsening of the problem, then it is they who will suffer the worst consequences. And geoengineering is a potential way to alleviate those consequences. So it's interesting to me to see how colonialism has been used, some might even say has been weaponized by the two sides in this particular debate. And of course, geoengineering is a very convenient way out of the real solution to this problem, which is to get off fossil fuels. There are powerful interests who would readily prefer that we pursue these sorts of techno fixes rather than sort of interfere with their business model of continued extraction and sale and burning of fossil fuels. So to me, it's sort of interesting, again, bringing this back to colonialism, that it's some of these same individuals the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses of the world that are telling us that we need to engineer our way out of this problem rather than getting off fossil fuels. And at the same time, they are funding the exploration of other planets, as if there's a planet B out there, as if there's another planet that can provide a home to us and other living things. So once again, this sort of theme of colonialism and how it enters into the conversations we're having today about the role of the global North and the global South in addressing this crisis, about the importance of sort of the Western world, the industrial world, providing resources, funding, financing to the developing world to help them cope with the loss and damage, which is the key term in that conversation, that they are already experiencing. And who are we to tell the Indias of the world that they shouldn't have access to 2 centuries of cheap, dirty fossil fuel energy to grow their economy if we don't have our own house in order? And so those are the thoughts that occurred to me.
Okay. I want to first let me thank you, Ram, for the extraordinary discussion. It's quite rich. There's a lot going on in there. I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual history parts of this, and particularly about this thing, right, that has an ism that goes with it, the environment, right? And how that might lead to a plurality of isms that we might reach back into your lineage to find. So, I mean, we might imagine, I think erroneously, that the environment is a stable empirical object, and you can have dispositions towards it, to assume dominion over it, to appropriate it, or to protect it and to appreciate it, right? To romanticize it. Now, there are 2 elements to a counter to this. One is that we might see nature instead as contingent, as relational, as a co-production of the social and biophysical worlds, right? Something which is, in Lefebvrean terms, both medium and outcome, right, of social process. If we turn to the disposition side of this, though, right, or let's say dispensations, right, towards the environment as things which are learned, socialized, experience-centered, right, but also then potentially plural and historical. That is, environmentalism isn't metahistorical because environments aren't metahistorical and societies aren't metahistorical. And I think that brings me to thinking about this lineage, right, and constructing this one in particular, as opposed to all of the other possible lineages, right? Because there have always been dispensations and productions of environment, right, in Indian intellectual history. And it takes me back to an essay that you actually wrote in 1992 on lineages of environment, right, in which you talked about some of these speakers, and I imagine they're going to appear in your book, right? But part of what's interesting about this to me is that there's only partial overlap about who you chose to speak about today and who you chose to speak about in that essay, right? The overlap being Geddes and Mukherjee, right? Now, in that essay, you end on a deeply optimistic note, right? It's quite hopeful. There's a discussion about the social and natural integrity of the village and urban harmony and forests and tribal worlds being united, right? But today we get to Gore on colonialism, right? The rapacious monster. We get Mira on the disturbance of Mother Earth, right? And with Mukherjee, it's about less about an ecological approach to social theory and planning and more about the destruction of the commons, right? And community management, right? With Geddes, the emphasis on vulnerability. So you've become more pessimistic? So that's one of my questions or potential points of discussion. And the other is, as we reach back into this history, right, can we pull not just one alternative environmentalism from it, right, but a body of them?
Can I just quickly?
Yeah, of course. Can you respond to
absolutely.
each of these?
Both the interventions are utterly fascinating. So let me just briefly respond.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So to start with you, Mark, absolutely. So there's a plurality of environmentalisms, and in the West, there's a debate between only one true path to protect biodiversity, or only one true path to solve the only geoengineering or never geoengineering. And I think it's important that there is this plurality, also including among the figures I've chosen. My essay is also, in a sense, elite environmentalism, because it's writers who can articulate themselves in print. They may be also, if you look at tribal and peasant communities, pre-modern communities in the forms of resource conservation and a natural knowledge they practiced or enacted. There could be a subaltern environmentalism reconstructed by anthropologists of that. So absolutely, that's a very good, thank you for that. On the pessimism part, it's interesting you note that. Now, maybe I've grown older, but I think there may be a more objective reason for this. And it is this, Mark, that when I wrote that essay in 1992, liberalization was just beginning. And there'd been 2 decades of grassroots activism that was inspiring, that was transforming public policy, that had led to the first Department of Environment and Forest, that had led to changes in the law, that had led to every newspaper taking the environmental question seriously. And then, in subsequent decades, as liberalization progressed, by the way, I should add, there are some aspects of liberalization that are totally welcome. But there are other aspects that are problematic from an environmental point of view. And for the gung-ho liberalizer who thought he could make India, Singapore at large, the main enemy was the environmentalists. At the demonization of environmentalists, someone like Medha Patkar, and if you see how much pernicious abuse is heaped on her by free market columnists, in the English language press. So maybe that's also part of it. That environmentalism in India is in the retreat. The young are talking about climate change, but in terms of collective action, in terms of articulation in mainstream media, it is invisible. And I sometimes joke that in the 1980s, every major Indian newspaper had an environmental correspondent. By the 2000s, it had either been laid off or redesignated stock market correspondent. So that my pessimism may possibly come from that. On Michael, your point about colonialism, I think that's very important. And I'll just make two quick points. One is the work of environmental historians in India and Africa, many people, has been to show that colonialism was well known as a political and military and economic watershed, but it was also an ecological watershed. I think that's something in the ways that Tagore talks about and environmental historians in India and Africa have talked about. But at the same time, in the global debate on environmental justice, positing the global South against the global North at one level is fine, but at a deeper level is more problematic, because at least when it comes to countries like India and China, they practice a form of internal colonialism. And again, we have recognized only the political aspects of the internal colonialism. The Chinese are crushing the Buddhist culture of Tibet. The Chinese are crushing the Islamic culture of Xinjiang. But there is also this resource extractive aspect to that colonialism. Likewise in India, if you look at the mining boom in central India and what it has done to our tribal communities, or hydroelectric projects in the fragile Himalaya in the northeast. So I think it's obligatory on Indians who are critical of Western colonialism to recognize the internal colonialism, and probably Chinese too. I mean, not smaller Asian or African countries, but India and China, because they no longer have empires outside to conquer. So Tagore thought they might want to go to the moon, and that's what Jeff Bezos thinks. Likewise, they prey on the resources and lands of the less fortunate of their own citizens.
A quick response. Yeah, Tariq and I were actually having a very relevant conversation just before the event about that very matter. We often frame this in terms of different nations and the global South or the global North. But even within these nations. Look at the United States, right? Look at the issues of environmental justice here in Philadelphia, where those sort of underserved communities, low-lying areas, prone to flooding every time we get one of these, tropical systems, hurricanes, like Hurricane Ida, which led to a flooding of the Schuylkill, and the combination of sort of coastal flooding with inland flooding hit certain places like Eastwick, a low-income area, extremely hard. There is quite a bit of research that shows that the areas that are most prone to flooding in cities like Philadelphia, in cities like New York, in cities like Atlanta, invariably are redlined areas, historically redlined areas. The same thing with urban heat stress. The hottest places in these cities are invariably redlined districts. And so the colonialism that we're talking about exists at the international level, but it also very much exists within nations like the US and India.
Thank you guys so much. The floor is now open for questions. So again, there's a mic at the back. So you have to, so that our online audience can hear, if you could make your way to the back and speak into the mic. And I've been instructed by Spencer, who I've learned very quickly to obey, to speak into the mic directly so that everyone can hear you.
Hello, my name is Ritin. I'm an undergraduate from New Delhi. I kind of wanted to challenge the framing of the discussion. It seems to me that humans, we're on this earth, there is scarcity, and the population is increasing. And the only way out of scarcity and conflict would be some kind of technological innovation that lets us do more from less and have more resources from our limited resources. And to that end, I'm kind of curious what you think of nuclear energy, which provides more energy with less with less harms and with fewer resources, and also why and what you think of space exploration, because that seems to me as the ultimate way out of scarcity. My own grandfather was a farmer, and I haven't met anyone more pro-nuclear energy. And it seems to me that we might be a little bit out of touch with what the average Indian actually even thinks about these new technologies and space exploration. And so I guess to summarize, I'm kind of curious what you think about nuclear energy, and I'm curious about your polarity on space exploration.
I mean, I think Michael and Mark are probably better equipped to answer some of the technical questions. But if you look at the nuclear energy industry in India, let me tell you something about India. The nuclear energy industry in India is the most secretive, anti-democratic industry possible. It is the only industry that is not subject to any scrutiny, either by the market or by parliament, because the Atomic Energy Act rules out even parliamentary scrutiny. And in pure financial terms, it has been shown, at least in India, that nuclear energy is economically unviable, let alone the problems of security, safety, disposal of radioactive waste, and so on. So, I think it's wonderful to be optimistic. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but the idea that technology will provide a solution to what are basically human problems, it can aid, it can help. Possibly, there are forms of energy that reduce our dependence on fossil fuel, but are accessible at the level of the ordinary man. I think scientists with an understanding of natural limits, rather than scientists who think there are no natural limits. That would be my. I think that would be my first response. But I'd like Michael to.
Sure, I agree with everything you said, Ram. And this was sort of one of the points that I was conveying. This idea that what I find truly remarkable when you talk to sort of the Bill Gateses of the world, those who advocate for geoengineering or nuclear, it's this sort of, there is this asymmetric pessimism. They are extremely dour about the potential for scaling up existing renewable energy. Bill Gates says we need a miracle, as if we don't have the technology now in the form of wind, solar, geothermal. There are multiple studies, groups at Stanford, UC Berkeley, elsewhere, that have demonstrated that The obstacles are not technological, they're purely political at this point. Renewable energy is actually cheaper on a levelized basis than nuclear, renewable energy cheaper than nuclear energy on a levelized basis, but we have all of these incentives, direct and indirect subsidies that actually prop up the fossil fuel industry and make it artificially competitive in the marketplace. This idea that, that somehow there's no way that we can solve this problem with existing technology, I find remarkable that it's coupled with this sort of Pollyannish optimism that we can colonize other planets, that we can deploy unprecedented planetary scale manipulations with a system we don't understand perfectly and somehow come out on top when the principle of unintended consequences reigns supreme with geoengineering and other techno fixes. So, it isn't that tough. The problem isn't that difficult. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the climate crisis. There are larger issues that we face of sustainability. There are finite resources on this planet. We can't continue to extract and use resources. Ultimately, we have to come to terms with these larger sustainability challenges. But when it comes to the climate crisis, again, it's not that difficult. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. The obstacles aren't physical, they're not technological, they are entirely political.
Go ahead.
Let me just say that Michael's infinitely more qualified to talk about nuclear energy than I am, and I agree with everything that Ram said. And let me emphasize that from my perspective, technology is not going to solve all of the environmental problems, right? It's not going to solve the problems of environment as lived experience, right? And in Rob Nixon's terms, inhabited risk, right? That equity and justice are not just about how much energy we can produce and how efficiently we can use it, but how it's distributed. It's also about recognition. It's also about people and livelihoods.
Ram, thank you so much for this really thought-provoking talk. I'm familiar with a lot of your writings over the decades that deal very sensitively with collective action. So Chipko movement, even before that, the peasant movements in Garhwal and Kumaon, since Gandhi, all sorts of collective movements. And I'm wondering about your decision to center this new project around individuals. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you envision the relationships between individual thinkers, intellectual history of individuals as it impacts or intersects with collectives and the ways that people collectively think, whether it's the farmers from whom our previous questioner descends, or rural villages. How do we think about the relationship between the individual and the collective?
Yeah, I think, I just, through the course of my research, stumbled across these thinkers. And a few of them I wrote about in the 1992 article that Mark mentioned. But I discovered more and I dug deeper into their writings, their oeuvre, and even what I will do in the book I'm working on is very partial. There's probably a great deal of work to be written by literary scholars. There have been writers in many of our Indian languages, in Hindi, in Malayalam, in Bengali, with a deep environmental sensibility reflected in their poems, their plays, their dramas. And there's a kind of a, Rob Dixon was mentioned by Mark, and the kind of work that Rob Dixon has done, if you extend it to Indian language creative writers. So, but on collective action, I'll just say this. This is a puzzle for which particularly the anthropologists and the social studies of science people in this room can answer. Today, Lisa, it's very difficult to get people onto the streets compared to 20, 30 years ago. You yourself, we were talking the other day about your work on Rasta Roko, Rail Roko, Bhook Hartal, hunger strike, stopping roads and so on. For any protest, I mean, even though I'm maybe less optimistic than I was before, I'm still a Jholawala who likes to protest. I'm happy to go out to the streets, but not many people gather. Part of the reason is the authoritarianism of the state. But part of the reason I believe, and this is something, it's an instinct which anthropologists have to probably have to work on, and sociologists of science, is that protest becomes individuated. And signing a petition on change.org becomes your means of protesting against environmental destruction. So, I mean, I remember the protests of the 80s and the 90s. Tens of thousands of people in the streets of Delhi, of Calcutta, of Bombay, singing songs, painting things. I mean, the farmers protested some of that. Right. But otherwise, I think, is it that the smartphone, the private computer, has limited the possibilities of non-violent collective action, at least in Indian cities? That's a question, I think, not just around environmental issues, but also around other social justice issues. I think that's a question anthropologists will have to address.
Ram, thank you again for truly a fantastic talk. I knew a couple of the people that you mentioned, but clearly really great to learn here. But I have a few questions. First is, I'm curious why you didn't pick Mahatma Gandhi as one of the environmentalists in your, maybe he's in the other five that you didn't mention, but given his early emphasis on self-sufficiency and resiliency, how is it that that wasn't a natural choice?
Well, this simple answer. I've already published 2,000 pages on him. So I thought I should say, I'm so identified as a Gandhi scholar that I wanted to showcase some. You're right, but he was an instinctive environmentalist, and many of his writings and sayings, including one that is relevant to technological optimists, where he talks about industrial civilization as a moth whirling faster and faster around the flame, seduced by its own potency and then perishing in the flame. You're right, but that's really the reason that, I've written so much about in the past, maybe I felt it's time to give him and me a break.
Okay. So I want to take you in a little bit more an optimistic direction. And so tell me, as you look at the movement today, or maybe the last decade or so, do you feel that we do have pioneers like you mentioned here that are really doing groundbreaking work at the individual level, making a difference? Or is there no one on the sort of national scene that's as visible?
So what's happened is there's very fine scholarship across the humanities and some aspects of natural sciences. So the outstanding environmental historians, sociologists, literature scholars, people who work on plant ecosystems, who work on marine ecosystems and so on. But it doesn't get integrated into policy. One reason is the lack of collective action. The other reason is actually the political economy of the Indian state. And this cuts across all political parties, where, funding of elections, political corruption means that governments never consult either the citizens or the social organizations, or indeed even the top scientists. For example, in my town, Bangalore, if the highway has to be built, the Indian Institute of Science has the best transport scientists who will tell you how to build it in a way congenial to a wider spectrum of the public using it, using less resources, destroying less of the landscape. But you'll go to the contractor who's willing to give you an electoral bond. So that's part of the reason. There's a wonderful report, Tariq mentioned my esteemed senior colleague, Professor Madhav Gadgil, and he wrote an extraordinary report on the Western Ghats, where he talked about what areas of the Western Ghats need to be protected, otherwise floods would arise. And that report was commissioned by the government and junked by the same government. And following the discarding of the report, all that he said has come true in terms of floods in Kerala, which are terribly destructive. So our governments are increasingly authoritarian, impatient of collective action, and also impervious to the best ecological scientific advice. And as this is across political parties. I think that's something which, that may be one reason for my pessimism too.
One final one, which is that, and Michael and Mark, you can chime in as well. I mean, if you look at some of the progress that, if you just look at the Human Development Index over the last 100 years and look at some of the stats put up by Mark Rosling and guys, it's really impressive what we've done on sort of the health and sort of economic development index, and that has come at a cost. So in the case of India, do you think that we're just sort of going up the natural hierarchy of needs, where we'll sort of at some point switch to caring a little bit more. I'm trying to balance some of this debate of pessimism with the fact that there's been a lot of progress on what we would call basic human index type metrics.
I'll just make one quick comment, and then Mark and Michael can go in. You see, the idea that every country follows the same path. From an environmental history point of view, there's a problem in that for two reasons. One is, as Gandhi famously said in 1928, actually a quote of his which is relevant to our discussions, where he said, Europe and America have already conquered all parts of the earth. How can India, what can India conquer except its own internal colonies? But Indian ecologies are much more fragile than temperate ecologies. Not only are we the most populous nation in the world, our ecologies are much more fragile and hence require a much more care and attention. You can't have the kind of farming you have in the American Midwest in most parts of India without terrible environmental damage. So I think actually, Gandhi was prophetic when he said that India cannot acquire colonies, so it has to make do with its own resources. Now, whether that involves, community action, scientific collaboration, or a technological miracle, these are all or political decentralization. One last point I'd make. I think political decentralization is very important for environmental sustainability. If local communities have control over their resources, they will manage it sustainably. If, on the other hand, a government in Delhi has the power to allocate a forest or a mine in Chhattisgarh to its favorite capitalist, that is not just economically and socially unwise, will also lead to environmental destruction.
Yeah, when you look at there are certain metrics, standard of living, the sort of state of healthcare. By various metrics, you might deduce that we are living in the best of all possible times, but we're doing so increasingly by going into environmental debt. And ultimately, we will pay the price. We're already starting to pay the price. So, for example, when it comes to the health of the global economy, we have seen interruptions to the global economy based on the disruption of supply chains. That is a result, in some cases, of extreme weather events. We have seen something like $30 billion or more extreme weather events just in the United States over the past few years. By some measure, the climate crisis will be a far deadlier crisis than the one that we went through over the past few years, the coronavirus crisis. Far more lives will be lost ultimately because of the detrimental impacts of climate change, extreme floods, devastating extreme weather events, coastal inundation, et cetera. So we're at this sort of juncture where we have, in some ways, leveraged technology, leveraged the carrying capacity of our planet well beyond the natural carrying capacity. One of the things we talked about the fact that India, by the end of this month, will be the largest country in the world, 1.43 billion people. Add in China, that's 3 billion right there. We passed 8 billion people. I used to say, there's 7+ billion people on the face of the planet. We have to correct ourselves. There are now 8 billion people on the face of the planet. So we're sort of at this point where we've leveraged the carrying capacity of the planet through technology, probably to its maximum. And we're starting to sort of see the decline on the other side of that curve. And if we're not careful, as we continue to go into environmental debt, we will almost irreversibly descend down the other side of that curve. And just imagine what happens when you've developed a global infrastructure to increase the carrying capacity of your planet by nearly an order of magnitude, and that infrastructure is vulnerable to the impacts that we're seeing of climate change. What happens when that infrastructure collapses and you no longer have a carrying capacity of 8 billion people? You're back to the natural carrying capacity of the planet of about 1 billion people. These are the sorts of problems, questions, challenges we really need to be thinking about right now before it's too late. Because once you go down the other side of that curve, once you start to see environmental collapse, the collapse of our societal infrastructure, it's very difficult to return.
Yeah, and let me just say that there's a very well-developed, let me say, lively debate in environmental economics about exactly this question. Does rising standard of living, right, create at least the opportunity for certain kinds of environmentalism? And without going into empirical issues or methodological issues with respect to that, that affluence is funded by energy. And it's really energetically expensive for all the reasons that Michael just talked about. So we may find that there's not enough affluence to go around to get us to that point.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. I see 2 people in line, so maybe you could take your questions together and then we'll give everyone a chance to respond. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was fascinated by your point on the need for political decentralization. So I just want to ask a follow-up about if you see a role for distributed energy resources and microgrids as a way of managing the intermittency of renewables, but still clean and reliable energy.
Thank you, Ram. That was a fantastic talk, both insightful and delightful. And so my questions are about 2 things. One, you ended your talk about an intellectual conversation that you want to, that this is an intervention about intellectual history, and you picked up these elite actors. And I want to go back to your first work, which is still in some sense your first love, Chipko movement, And I wonder if you want to create a conversation around a set of environmental concerns between the Chipko activist and these elite actors. Would that'd be a real intellectual history where you kind of create some shared intellectual concerns that emerge. And that conversation will be a great ending to this book between your first work and this work. But that's just a thought, and maybe you want to say more about this. Thank you very much for a great talk.
Thanks. Yeah, Ram, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so thank you for that thought, Ram. And I mean that's a good way of maybe, but I did not. I would do it gently. I wouldn't get into advocacy. I wouldn't want to suggest that Tagore or Mukherjee or Mirabean writing in the 1920s or 1940s had all the answers. In a kind of epistemological sense, yet they were asking the right questions or anticipating the kind of questions we need to ask and answer now. So maybe I'll frame it that way. Or political decentralization. Before I can't answer the question about grids, and my colleagues can. But let me just say just one thing: that let's take the example of mining in India. Supposing a local community had ownership over the mine, which is in a forest, and a prospector from Bombay came and said, I want to mine it. And negotiated with the local community an arrangement where some mining happens, but people from the local community get employment, get a share of the profits, and it's done in a sustainable way. Instead of the central government saying, we will exercise the power of eminent domain, we will sign a direct contract with this prospector from Bombay and leave everyone out. And that's why the conflicts that arise are taking place. The rise of Maoist insurgency in central India is a direct product of this kind of, crony capitalism over mining, and of course makes the problem even worse. So in that sense, I think political decentralization can produce more responsible natural resource management. But on the technical question you asked, maybe, Michael, you want to answer?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to weigh in. The short answer is that, of course, the solution isn't to build fossil fuel-driven energy grids in every country on the planet. We have much better technology now. There's no reason for India, China, the other countries of the world to make the same mistake that we made. It's sometimes said that the Stone Age didn't end for want of stones. And the fossil fuel age won't end for want of fossil fuels. It will end because something better has come along. And so what we need is distributed energy, renewably driven. We need to provide the resources to developing countries so that it is economically advantageous to them to not make the same mistake that we made. It is economically advantageous to them to skip the fossil fuel stage of their economic development and go directly to distributed renewable energy. It seems obvious, it seems like a no-brainer, and yet we still see efforts, in particular by the fossil fuel industry, to, in essence, colonize these other countries and develop a fossil fuel-driven grid that will keep them addicted to fossil fuels for decades to come.
Well, let me say once again, thank you to all three of you, and especially to Ram for his riveting talk, and to all of you for coming and staying and asking questions. And join me once again in thanking all of our panelists. And you're now welcome to join us in the reception. There's food and drink. And we talked a lot about fuel, so you can refuel them yourselves in the back. And thanks again for joining us. Please join me in giving everyone a hand.